500 bodies. 1 pit. 3 days to dig, 6 hours to fill, and the rest of human history to understand what it meant when medieval people had to process the unprocessable. When normal burial became impossible, when the priest was dead or dying, when grave diggers refused to touch corpses because touching corpses meant joining them in the ground within 72 hours, when Christian ritual demanded individual burial in consecrated ground but reality demanded mass disposal before decomposition created worse problems than plague itself. When medieval society, built on hierarchies older than anyone could remember, on rituals inherited from ancestors stretching back to Constantine's conversion of Rome, on beliefs about proper death and resurrection that defined civilization itself and separated Christians from pagans and heretics, had to choose between maintaining traditions that had governed death for 1,000 years and surviving plague that was killing faster than traditions could accommodate. 500 bodies dumped into a pit dug hastily outside the monastery walls, layered with quicklime that burned flesh off bone and created chemical soup that archaeologists would struggle to excavate 600 years later, covered with 6 feet of earth to prevent dogs from digging up corpses and spreading infection through scavenging, and forgotten for 6 centuries until modern archaeologists uncovered what medieval people tried desperately to bury physically and psychologically and spiritually. This isn't a story about plague killing millions. That story's been told in endless documentaries and history books and academic papers that reduce human suffering to statistics and charts. This is about what plague did to the survivors. About the psychological break that happens when you throw your children into a pit with strangers' corpses and walk away knowing they'll never have individual graves, never have markers with their names carved in stone, never have annual memorial masses spoken in their memory, never be remembered as individuals but only as plague statistics in mortality registers. About the theological crisis that erupts when eternal salvation requires proper burial in consecrated ground with full Christian ritual, but plague makes proper burial suicidal for anyone who touches infected corpses oozing blood and pus. About how medieval people process trauma that shouldn't be processable, death that shouldn't be survivable, horror that broke their entire conceptual framework for understanding reality, and forced them to rebuild that framework while more people died around them daily at accelerating rates that suggested exponential growth toward total extinction. The pit was discovered in 2013 during routine excavations at Thornton Abbey in rural Lincolnshire, England, a quiet corner of the countryside where nothing much had happened for centuries and nothing much was expected to happen during archaeological investigation. Archaeologists from the University of Sheffield were investigating a small mound south of the monastery's walls, expecting medieval refuse or possibly foundation stones from demolished buildings or maybe pottery sherds that would help date different phases of monastery construction over its 400-year existence. Standard archaeological procedure: test trenches dug in careful grid patterns, soil analysis to identify occupation layers, documentation of every artifact no matter how mundane. Nothing particularly exciting anticipated beyond routine data collection that would eventually become someone's PhD thesis footnote or maybe a short article in a regional archaeology journal that nobody outside specialists would read. Then the shovels hit bone. Not one skeleton in expected medieval burial position, laid out carefully in east-west orientation with hands folded across the chest. Not 2 or 3 buried in sequence over decades as churchyard burials accumulated over generations of deaths. Dozens. Adults and children mixed together in chaotic arrangement that violated every medieval burial custom that every archaeologist on site knew by heart from years of excavating churchyards across England. Bodies bound in shrouds, wrapped tightly enough that the fabric compression left permanent marks on skeletal shoulders visible 600 years after burial, compressed together so densely that individual skeletons were difficult to distinguish and the excavation team had to work extraordinarily slowly to avoid mixing up remains from different individuals, which would have made subsequent analysis impossible. No coffins despite medieval Christians believing coffins protected bodies from decomposition until resurrection and provided dignity appropriate for souls awaiting judgment before God. No grave goods despite tradition going back to pagan times demanding objects to accompany the dead into the afterlife. No jewelry indicating wealth or status. No coins placed in mouths to pay mythological ferrymen. No pottery vessels containing food for the journey. No tools that might be needed in afterlife. Nothing but shrouded bodies dumped into earth. No order despite churchyards organizing burials in careful rows oriented east-west with families grouped together in family plots and social status reflected in proximity to church buildings where wealthy patrons were buried inside the church itself. Just bodies. Stacked, layered, crammed into a pit approximately 5 meters long by 4 meters wide by 2 meters deep, dimensions that were measured and documented with centimeter precision. 48 skeletons were recovered, though archaeologists believe more were lost to soil acidification that destroyed bone in the lower layers where acidic groundwater had percolated through the burial for 6 centuries, and medieval disturbance when later construction projects unknowingly dug through portions of the mass grave without recognizing what they were destroying. 27 were children, their small skeletons instantly recognizable from bone size and development, their presence immediately transforming this from archaeological curiosity into emotional devastation for excavators who recognized they were uncovering evidence of catastrophe that killed entire families in days or weeks. 6 were women identified through pelvic bone morphology that differs systematically between sexes. The rest were men or adolescents whose sex couldn't be determined from fragmented remains or whose skeletal markers were ambiguous. The archaeologists knew immediately this wasn't normal burial. Knew before radiocarbon dating, before DNA analysis, before consulting historical documents in monastery archives. The burial style itself screamed emergency, crisis, catastrophe. Normal medieval burial followed strict protocols developed over centuries of Christian tradition, protocols so deeply embedded in culture that violating them was unthinkable under normal circumstances, protocols that defined civilized Christian death in opposition to pagan practices. The deceased was washed by family members who performed this final intimate act of care, who prepared the body for resurrection by cleansing it of earthly corruption and bodily fluids that medieval people found disturbing and polluting. The corpse was dressed in a shroud, usually white linen symbolizing purity and innocence before God's judgment, sometimes burial clothes that wealthy families kept specifically for death and inherited across generations as precious heirlooms. A priest administered last rites if possible, if the dying person remained conscious long enough to confess sins and receive absolution, ensuring spiritual preparation for judgment that determined eternal destination in heaven or hell. The body was laid out in the family home for a wake where community members paid respects, where social bonds were reinforced through shared mourning that integrated individual deaths into community experience, where the deceased transitioned from living community member to ancestral memory preserved in collective consciousness. A funeral procession carried the deceased to the churchyard, the procession route often following specific paths sanctified by centuries of use, sometimes stopping at specific locations for prayers. The grave was dug in consecrated ground blessed by a bishop at the churchyard's establishment, oriented east-west so the resurrected body would face Jerusalem at the second coming when Christ would return to judge all souls living and dead. The corpse was placed in a coffin if the family could afford one, the coffin itself a status symbol indicating wealth and social standing within community hierarchies. The grave was filled while prayers were recited, prayers whose specific wording had been standardized over centuries of church councils and theological debate. A marker indicated the burial location, a wooden cross for common people, stone monuments for wealthy families who could afford mason work and wanted permanent commemoration. Annual commemorations on death anniversaries kept the deceased's memory alive in community consciousness, integrated the dead into ongoing social life through ritualized remembrance that prevented complete forgetting. This was how Christians died in medieval Europe. This was the process that gave death meaning beyond biological termination, that transformed mere ending into spiritual transition, that reassured the living they would see their dead again in paradise after their own deaths and resurrections at the end of time. None of that happened at Thornton Abbey. Absolutely none of it. Complete abandonment of every protocol. The bodies were thrown into a pit dug in unconsecrated ground outside the monastery walls, technically on monastery property but not in the official cemetery that had been blessed and designated for Christian burial through elaborate church rituals. They were buried together without regard for family relationships that medieval society considered sacred and eternal, that defined social identity and property inheritance and spiritual obligations. They received no individual graves, no markers identifying who they were or when they died, no prayers recorded in burial registers that would have preserved their names for posterity and ensured their integration into church commemoration cycles. The grave was dug quickly. The sides are uneven and rough, lacking the careful perpendicular shaping of planned burials where grave diggers took professional pride in craftsmanship and could be fined by church authorities for sloppy work. The bodies were deposited rapidly. The positioning is chaotic, with limbs overlapping in bodies at inconsistent depths suggesting they were dropped rather than carefully laid out in dignified positions. The pit was filled hastily. The soil layers show rapid deposition rather than the gradual filling that occurred when families gathered around a grave for hours of prayer and remembrance and formal goodbye rituals. Everything about this mass grave screams emergency, crisis, panic. The complete abandonment of every principle that made medieval burial meaningful and distinguished Christian death from animal carcass disposal or pagan practices that Christians defined themselves against. But here's what makes this discovery psychologically devastating rather than merely archaeologically interesting or historically significant. The bodies were shrouded carefully. Every single one that could be assessed showed evidence of shrouding. Someone took time to wrap each corpse individually in linen binding that compressed shoulders inward and positioned arms along the body in traditional burial position. Someone performed the basic minimum ritual of preparation for burial despite circumstances that destroyed every other burial custom. Someone cared enough to preserve dignity despite circumstances that destroyed dignity at every other level and made maintaining dignity actively dangerous. The children especially show evidence of careful wrapping, meticulous binding that would have taken precious time during crisis when every minute mattered and more people were dying hourly. Small bodies treated with tenderness even in mass disposal emergency. Parents binding their children's corpses before surrendering them to a mass grave where they would lie for eternity mixed with strangers' bones, where individual identity would be lost, where family groupings would be impossible to maintain. That single detail reveals the psychological horror medieval people experienced at places like Thornton Abbey. They knew this was wrong. They knew with absolute certainty that these bodies deserved individual burial in consecrated ground with full Christian ritual performed by ordained priests speaking Latin prayers that most lay people didn't understand but knew were necessary for salvation. They knew the deceased souls might be endangered by improper burial, that God might judge improperly buried souls more harshly, that resurrection might not work properly if bodies weren't positioned correctly in consecrated ground blessed by legitimate church authority. Medieval theology was actually ambiguous on this point. Different theologians argued different positions about whether burial location affected salvation, but the ambiguity itself terrified people who wanted certainty about their eternal destinations and their dead relatives' eternal destinations. But they had no choice. The mathematics was undeniable. The dead outnumbered the living's capacity to bury them properly. There weren't enough grave diggers. There weren't enough priests. There wasn't enough consecrated ground in the parish cemetery. There wasn't enough time before more people died and the bodies accumulated faster than they could be processed through traditional burial protocols. So they did what they could, wrapped the bodies as carefully as time and safety permitted, spoke whatever prayers they remembered without benefit of priests who were dead or dying or fled to safer regions, and tried to maintain minimal dignity while violating everything they believed about proper death. The archaeologists sent tooth samples to McMaster University in Canada for ancient DNA analysis using cutting-edge techniques developed specifically for extracting genetic material from archaeological remains. Teeth preserve DNA better than other skeletal elements because tooth enamel protects the inner pulp cavity where DNA survives for centuries in the right soil conditions with stable temperature and pH levels. Ancient DNA extraction from medieval teeth is now standard procedure for identifying pathogens, for understanding disease history and evolution, for reconstructing plague genetics across centuries and determining how different plague strains evolved and spread. The lab at McMaster specialized in plague DNA extraction, having developed sophisticated techniques for amplifying degraded ancient genetic material that exists in tiny quantities in archaeological specimens. Yersinia pestis DNA was found in multiple samples from different individuals scattered across the mass grave, proving this wasn't a single infected person buried among others who died from different causes like malnutrition or violence. This was mass plague mortality. Specifically, the strain circulating during the Black Death pandemic that killed between 40 and 60% of England's population between 1348 and 1350, that depopulated entire villages leaving ghost settlements that archaeology can still identify. That killed so many people that modern demographic analysis suggests England didn't recover pre-plague population levels until the 16th century, 200 years later. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the burial occurred mid-14th century, right in the Black Death window when plague swept through England in waves. The combination of DNA evidence proving plague infection, radiocarbon dates placing burial in the plague years, burial style indicating emergency mass disposal, and historical records documenting Black Death mortality in Lincolnshire leaves no doubt whatsoever. This mass grave was dug during the worst pandemic in European history, when the Black Death was killing so many people so quickly that normal burial became physically impossible in rural communities overwhelmed by death without urban resources to manage mass casualties. Before we explore how medieval people psychologically processed this trauma, and I promise you, the coping mechanisms range from beautiful to horrifying, from theologically sophisticated to brutally pragmatic, from culturally transformative to personally devastating, comment where you're watching from. Because mass graves like this one were dug across Europe during plague years, from Iceland to Sicily, from Portugal to Russia, in every region connected to trade networks that spread plague. If you're European, your ancestors either survived plague by genetic immunity or pure luck, or they died and were buried in graves exactly like Thornton Abbey. There's literally no third option. Every single European family line that exists today survived the Black Death. Someone in your ancestry lived through this nightmare and somehow processed the unprocessable trauma of mass death, of burying their children in mass graves, of watching their entire communities die around them at rates that seemed apocalyptic. Comment your location. Let's see if archaeologists have found mass graves near your hometown. Let's map plague burials across modern Europe. Let's understand that this isn't distant abstract history disconnected from your life. This is your specific history, written in mass graves dug by your specific ancestors who survived when half the people around them died screaming in agony from bubonic plague. The psychological processing started before the first body hit the pit. It started when medieval people realized normal burial was impossible, that the traditional protocols they had always followed without question were suddenly inadequate for the crisis they faced. When the death toll exceeded burial capacity and the mathematics of mass death became undeniable. 50 people died yesterday in a village of 500, 60 today, 70 projected tomorrow based on infection rates, and the parish has 4 gravediggers of whom 2 are now sick, showing the characteristic buboes in their armpits, and will be dead within 3 days, leaving only 2 gravediggers for 70 bodies per day. When gravediggers died or fled to safer regions, abandoning communities to bury their own dead without professional help or knowledge of proper grave construction. When priests died before administering last rites, leaving the dying without spiritual preparation that everyone believed determined eternal salvation or damnation. When families had to choose between burying their dead properly, which meant touching infected corpses oozing infectious fluids and contracting plague with 90% mortality, and protecting living children from infection by abandoning proper burial and preserving parental survival to care for remaining family members. The medieval mind wasn't prepared for these choices. Medieval cosmology placed death in a comprehensible framework that made sense of suffering and mortality and gave meaning to existence. Life was temporary suffering preparing souls for eternal judgment, a short period of testing that determined infinite afterlife in heaven or hell. Death was transition, not termination. The soul continued in conscious existence while the body waited in the grave for resurrection at history's end. Proper Christian burial ensured resurrection and salvation, or at least didn't endanger them through improper treatment of the body that would house the resurrected soul. The body would rise from the grave at the second coming, reassemble miraculously from dust and bones through God's power, and ascend to heaven if the soul was judged worthy based on faith and deeds. But this entire theological framework assumed proper burial. It assumed consecrated ground blessed by bishops with legitimate church authority. It assumed individual graves where bodies remained undisturbed until resurrection, where God could find them and reassemble them correctly. It assumed Christian ritual performed by priests who knew the correct prayers and procedures that validated burial in God's eyes. The mass grave at Thornton Abbey violated literally all these assumptions. Every single one. Would God resurrect bodies buried improperly in unconsecrated mass graves? Would resurrection work if bodies were mixed together, if skeletal remains from different people were impossibly entangled so that God couldn't tell whose bones were whose when resurrection day arrived? Could souls find their bodies after resurrection if no marker indicated burial location and no memory preserved who was buried where in the chaotic mass grave? These questions haunted plague survivors like recurring nightmares that destroyed sleep and sanity, that made them question everything they believed about God's justice and mercy. These theological anxieties drove behavior that seems bizarre or cruel to modern observers but made desperate psychological sense to people whose entire worldview was collapsing under pandemic death that seemed to target the righteous and wicked equally without moral discrimination that would indicate divine judgment. The first coping mechanism was ritual maintenance, even when complete ritual became impossible. Even when full Christian burial couldn't be performed because circumstances prevented it, people maintained fragments of ritual to preserve psychological connection to normalcy and tradition and meaning. The shrouding at Thornton Abbey demonstrates this perfectly and heartbreakingly. Wrapping corpses in linen was the first step in traditional burial preparation, the initial ritual that began the transformation of dead body into resurrected soul, that marked the transition from living person to honored ancestor. It couldn't prevent mass burial, couldn't ensure consecrated ground, couldn't provide individual graves with stone markers and annual memorial masses and family plot preservation. But it was something. It was one piece of normal burial that remained physically possible even during catastrophic epidemic when everything else failed. And people clung to it desperately because maintaining any ritual fragment helped them feel they weren't completely abandoning their dead, weren't completely violating Christian duties that they believed determined eternal salvation for themselves and their deceased family members. weren't completely failing as family members and community members who had basic obligations to care for deceased loved ones according to customs inherited from countless generations. Modern trauma psychology calls this cognitive scaffolding, maintaining familiar routines during chaos to preserve sense of control and meaning when external reality has become uncontrollable and meaningless, when normal patterns have completely broken down. Medieval people didn't have that terminology or psychological framework, but they understood the principle instinctively through lived experience. If you can't do everything properly because circumstances make complete ritual impossible, do something properly. If you can't ensure salvation through full ritual, perform whatever ritual remains possible and pray to God's mercy that it's sufficient for eternal life. Maintain whatever fragments of normalcy you can grasp because those fragments are all that stands between sanity and complete psychological collapse. The second coping mechanism was theological reinterpretation and flexibility that would have been unthinkable before plague forced the issue. When reality contradicts established doctrine, humans either change reality or change doctrine. Medieval people couldn't change plague reality, couldn't stop mass death, couldn't return to normal burial, couldn't wish pandemic away through prayer or penance. So they changed doctrine. They reinterpreted Christian theology to accommodate mass burial and make it spiritually acceptable. Priests preaching during plague years emphasized that God judged souls based on faith and confession and moral character, not burial locations and ritual correctness. That salvation depended on internal spiritual state at death rather than external circumstances of burial over which dying people had no control. That God's mercy extended to those buried improperly through necessity rather than sin or neglect. That God in His infinite power could certainly reassemble bodies and resurrect souls regardless of burial circumstances because resurrection was miraculous anyway and didn't depend on human ritual competence. These weren't entirely new theological positions. Various church fathers had made similar arguments in different contexts over centuries. But they became emphasized heavily during plague years precisely because plague survivors needed reassurance that their dead weren't condemned to hell by improper burial forced on them by catastrophic circumstances beyond human control. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the Black Death in Florence and recorded his experiences in the Decameron, documented that priests during plague years assured people that God looks upon the heart, not the grave. That resurrection would work for mass burial victims as surely as for those buried with full ritual in consecrated ground. That the sin was refusing to help dying neighbors out of selfish fear, not failing to perform impossible burial rituals during pandemic that made normal procedures suicidal. This theological flexibility probably saved survivors from complete psychological breakdown and made continued Christian faith possible after trauma that could have destroyed religious belief entirely. The third coping mechanism was psychological distancing that enabled continued functioning despite overwhelming death. This one's dark but completely understandable from trauma psychology perspective. When death becomes overwhelming, when bodies accumulate faster than emotional processing capacity, humans defend themselves by dehumanizing corpses temporarily. By thinking of dead bodies as objects requiring disposal rather than as people deserving elaborate ritual and emotional engagement. The archaeological evidence from Thornton Abbey shows this psychological split playing out in real time in the same burial. The careful shrouding indicates people still saw the dead as human, as deserving dignity, as loved family members whose souls might be watching from purgatory. But the mass grave itself indicates simultaneous psychological distancing. Throwing bodies into a pit is object disposal, not human burial according to medieval categories. Both things happened simultaneously in the same action because medieval people were caught between emotional connection to their dead and psychological necessity of treating corpses as sanitation problems requiring rapid solution before decomposition created health hazards. Trauma psychologists call this emotional numbing, the mind's defense mechanism against overwhelming grief that would paralyze survival functions if experienced fully. Medieval people facing pandemic couldn't afford paralysis when more people were dying daily and survival required continued functioning despite horror. So they numbed temporarily. They shrouded carefully, maintaining emotional connection during that intimate act, then threw the shrouded corpse into a mass grave, psychologically distancing enough to complete disposal and return to caring for living family members who might still be saved. The cognitive dissonance must have been excruciating, but it was survivable. Complete emotional connection to every death would have been psychologically fatal, would have destroyed survivors' capacity to function when function was necessary for anyone to survive. Now here's my question for you. Leave your answer in the comments because I'm genuinely curious about this. What would you do? If plague killed half your community in 6 months, If normal burial became physically impossible because there weren't enough living people to dig graves and bodies were accumulating in houses, if maintaining tradition meant touching infected corpses and dying within days with near certainty, if abandoning tradition meant violating everything you believed about death and salvation and family duty, what would you choose? Would you maintain ritual despite personal risk? Would you abandon ritual completely to maximize survival chances? Would you find compromise like the Thornton Abbey community did, maintaining shrouding ritual while accepting mass burial necessity? Your answer reveals something important about how you prioritize duty versus survival, tradition versus pragmatism, community obligations versus self-preservation. Comment below. Let's debate this because it's not abstract historical theory. It's the exact choice thousands of healthcare workers faced during COVID-19 when treating patients meant infection risk, the choice emergency responders face during every mass casualty event when protocol breaks down, the choice humans face whenever crisis forces impossible decisions between conflicting values that can't all be honored simultaneously. The fourth coping mechanism was blame displacement and scapegoating that provided psychological relief through explanation. When trauma becomes unbearable, when suffering seems meaningless and random, humans desperately need explanations that restore sense of control and meaning and justice. Medieval people needed to understand why plague was happening, why God was allowing such catastrophic suffering that seemed to target righteous and wicked equally, why normal burial became impossible in Christian Europe. They developed multiple explanations that seem bizarre to modern minds but provided essential psychological relief to people whose worldview was shattering. Some blamed Jews, claiming they poisoned wells or angered God through rejection of Christ or practiced secret rituals that brought divine punishment on Christians. This led to horrific pogroms across Europe where entire Jewish communities were massacred by Christian mobs seeking scapegoats for inexplicable suffering. Some blamed sinners, claiming plague was divine punishment requiring communal repentance. This led to the flagellant movement where people whipped themselves bloody in public processions, performing dramatic penance to appease God's wrath and stop plague through collective suffering. Some blamed astrological conjunctions, claiming unfortunate planetary alignments corrupted air and caused disease through natural mechanisms that God permitted. This provided naturalistic explanation that removed moral judgment while maintaining sense that plague had comprehensible cause rather than being random chaos. All these explanations shared one crucial feature. They gave survivors something to do, some action that might prevent further plague deaths. Punish scapegoats. Perform penance. Avoid corrupted air. Action provides psychological relief from helplessness even when the action is completely ineffective at solving the actual problem or even makes things worse. Modern psychologists call this illusion of control, the belief that one's actions influence outcomes even when outcomes are determined by factors beyond individual control. Medieval people needed that illusion desperately because accepting that plague was random, uncontrollable, and meaningless would have destroyed their entire theological framework that promised a meaningful, ordered universe governed by divine providence and moral justice. The fifth coping mechanism was dark humor that sounds completely inappropriate but is actually one of the most psychologically healthy trauma responses. When horror becomes too overwhelming for direct emotional processing, humor creates psychological distance that enables continued functioning without complete emotional numbing. The sources from plague years are filled with gallows humor that would shock modern sensibilities but helped medieval people cope with daily death. Boccaccio recorded jokes about plague corpses and burial practices in the Decameron's frame narrative. English sources describe drinking parties in cemeteries while corpses were being buried. Italian sources mention people celebrating inheritances from dead relatives even while bodies remained unburied in houses. This wasn't callousness or lack of emotional connection. It was psychological survival mechanism. Modern emergency responders, soldiers in combat zones, and healthcare workers in overwhelmed ICUs all develop similar dark humor because it's psychologically necessary for processing ongoing trauma while maintaining functionality. The alternative is emotional breakdown that prevents continued response to ongoing crisis. Medieval people facing months of plague deaths couldn't afford breakdown when more people kept dying and survivors had to continue functioning to care for the living. So they joked. They laughed at the absurdity of 500 bodies in one pit. They made light of situations that would otherwise drive them insane with grief and horror. And that dark humor, preserved in contemporary sources, reveals the humanity of people trying desperately to remain human while circumstances push them toward psychological collapse. The archaeological evidence from Thornton Abbey reveals one more coping mechanism that's simultaneously beautiful and heartbreaking in what it shows about human resilience under catastrophe. The children in the mass grave were positioned more carefully than the adults despite emergency circumstances. They were generally placed in rows rather than thrown randomly. Their shrouds show evidence of tighter, more careful binding that would have required extra time. Someone, probably parents, possibly monastery caretakers, made extra effort to maintain dignity for dead children even in mass burial emergency when maintaining any dignity was difficult. This makes perfect psychological sense from trauma perspective. Adults could be dehumanized more easily through psychological distancing mechanisms. Adults dying of plague could be rationalized as God's judgment on sinners who deserved punishment. But children dying violated every medieval belief about divine justice. Children were innocent, hadn't had time to sin significantly, couldn't be blamed for plague through moral failure. Their deaths couldn't be explained as punishment. Their suffering served no theological purpose that medieval Christianity could articulate convincingly. So survivors maintained extra care for children's bodies because psychological distancing failed, because emotional connection couldn't be severed, because treating children's corpses as disposal objects would have completed the psychological breakdown that numbing and distancing prevented. The careful positioning of children's bodies in the Thornton Abbey mass grave reveals parents attempting to preserve dignity for their dead children despite circumstances that destroyed dignity for everyone else. It shows love persisting through catastrophe. It demonstrates that some emotional connections remain intact even when everything else fails. What happened after the pit was filled? How did survivors process the trauma of mass burial once immediate crisis passed and plague mortality declined? The evidence comes from multiple sources: archaeological surveys of cemetery usage after plague years, historical records of memorial practices and charitable donations, theological writings addressing plague trauma and survivor guilt, and analysis of cultural changes following the Black Death. The patterns reveal systematic attempt to psychologically compensate for mass burials' violations of Christian tradition. First, survivors established new burial customs specifically designed to address plague graves and provide some form of commemoration. They erected crosses or stone markers near mass graves even though individual graves within the mass burial couldn't be identified. The marker commemorated everyone buried there collectively, allowing memorial practices to continue even when individual commemoration became impossible. Several plague cemeteries across Europe show evidence of markers erected decades after burial, suggesting survivors eventually returned to commemorate their dead once immediate trauma faded enough to permit psychological engagement with grief rather than continued numbing. Second, they endowed masses and prayers for plague victims' souls through charitable donations to churches and monasteries. When proper burial couldn't be performed, spiritual compensation through prayer and religious service became paramount. Wealthy survivors established charities funding prayers for all plague victims, including those buried in mass graves without individual names or commemoration. This provided theological reassurance that lack of proper burial wouldn't damn souls to hell because God's mercy plus human prayer could compensate for burial circumstances forced by emergency rather than chosen through neglect. Third, and most significantly, they fundamentally changed Christian burial theology in ways that persisted for centuries. Before the Black Death, proper burial in consecrated ground was considered absolutely essential for salvation by most medieval theologians. After the Black Death, when millions had been buried improperly through necessity rather than choice, Christian theology shifted to emphasize that God's grace extended to those buried improperly through unavoidable circumstances. The theological change wasn't explicit. No church council formally declared new doctrine. It was gradual, emerging through thousands of sermons and theological writings addressing plague survivors' anxieties about their dead's eternal fates. But the change was real and permanent. Post-plague Christian theology placed less emphasis on burial location and ritual correctness, more emphasis on faith and confession and moral character at the moment of death. This theological flexibility persisted long after plague ended. It influenced Protestant Reformation debates about salvation that emerged 2 centuries later. It shaped Catholic responses to mass casualties during religious wars and later epidemics. The Black Death forced Christian theology to accommodate mass burial, and that accommodation became permanent doctrinal shift that changed Christian understanding of death and resurrection and salvation. Fourth, they developed elaborate danse macabre artistic traditions depicting death as the great equalizer that unified all social classes. These artistic and theatrical traditions emerged directly from plague trauma. They showed skeletons dancing with living people of all social ranks, popes and peasants, merchants and monks, children and elderly, nobility and commoners, everyone equally subject to death regardless of status or wealth. This artistic tradition served multiple psychological functions for plague survivors. It normalized death by making it visible and publicly discussable rather than hidden and taboo. It provided sense of meaning by framing death as universal human experience rather than random personal catastrophe. It democratized death by emphasizing that plague killed rich and poor alike without respect for the social hierarchies medieval society considered divinely ordained and eternal. This democratic vision of death was psychologically revolutionary. It suggested that maybe social hierarchies weren't eternal or divinely mandated if death could destroy them so thoroughly and mix nobles' bones with peasants' bones in mass graves. It planted intellectual seeds for social changes that would eventually erode feudalism and enable emergence of more egalitarian political systems over subsequent centuries. The Danse Macabre tradition was medieval people processing plague trauma through art, transforming personal psychological horror into cultural production that helped entire societies make sense of catastrophic death. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly for long-term cultural impact, plague survivors fundamentally reconceptualized the relationship between individual and community obligations. Pre-plague medieval society emphasized community bonds above individual interests, collective obligations over personal desires, hierarchical relationships where everyone knew their place and duties within stable social orders. Plague destroyed those communal bonds brutally and obviously. When families abandoned infected relatives to die alone, when neighbors refused to help dying neighbors out of infection fear, when priests fled parishes rather than administer last rites to plague victims, when the entire social fabric tore under pandemic stress, survivors recognized that community bonds they had considered eternal and sacred were actually fragile and contingent on circumstances. Post-plague European culture shifted significantly toward individualism. People prioritized immediate family over extended community. They emphasized personal salvation over collective ritual. They pursued personal wealth and advancement rather than maintaining traditional social positions. They questioned traditional authority more readily. They demanded higher wages and better treatment because labor scarcity after plague deaths gave them unprecedented bargaining power. They moved more freely geographically, leaving ancestral villages to seek opportunities elsewhere. These changes weren't immediate or universal or revolutionary in the short term, but they were real and consequential over the long term. The Black Death initiated gradual cultural transformation from medieval communal society to early modern individualistic society. And that transformation started at places like Thornton Abbey, where people had to choose between community burial traditions and personal survival, where they learned through brutal experience that maintaining community obligations during crisis could kill you, where survivors emerged traumatized but also partially liberated from social bonds that plague proved weren't sacred or eternal or worth dying to maintain. The mass grave at Thornton Abbey was excavated completely, studied exhaustively, and then reburied with great care and ceremony. The 48 skeletons were analyzed using every available scientific technique, then returned to the ground in the same location where they had lain for 6 centuries. A small interpretive marker now indicates the site for tourists and history enthusiasts. Visitors to Thornton Abbey can see the mound where 500 bodies, 48 confirmed through excavation, possibly more lost to soil acidification and medieval disturbance, were buried during England's worst pandemic. Most tourists don't realize what they're seeing unless they read the marker carefully. Don't understand that this small mound represents the psychological breaking point where medieval civilization fractured under pandemic stress, where people had to process the unprocessable, where traditional burial became impossible and survivors had to choose between maintaining ritual and surviving crisis, where the psychological trauma was so overwhelming that it changed Christian theology, altered European culture permanently, and initiated social transformations that would reshape civilization over subsequent centuries. But here's what makes the Thornton Abbey discovery uniquely important for modern pandemic understanding. This wasn't urban London where royal authorities planned emergency burial grounds in advance of plague arrival based on intelligence from continental Europe. This wasn't Venice or Florence or other wealthy cities with resources and administrative capacity to manage mass casualties through organized response. This was rural Lincolnshire. Small population, minimal resources, no advance warning, no preparation, no emergency plans. Just sudden catastrophic mortality overwhelming a community completely unprepared for mass death. And that community responded by doing everything they could to maintain human dignity while accepting that full traditional burial was impossible. They shrouded the bodies as carefully as time and safety permitted. They dug the pit on monastery ground, trying to approximate consecrated burial even if full Christian ritual couldn't be performed with priests and prayers. They positioned children more carefully than adults, maintaining extra dignity for innocents whose deaths most violated their understanding of divine justice. They did what they could with what they had while processing trauma that modern psychology would consider potentially psychologically fatal. That response: maintaining dignity within catastrophe, preserving ritual fragments when full ritual becomes impossible, prioritizing what matters most when everything can't be done properly. That's the crucial lesson for modern mass casualty response and disaster management. Emergency responders at terrorist attacks, natural disasters, pandemics, and mass shootings face similar impossible choices where normal protocols break down. Full protocol becomes impossible when circumstances overwhelm capacity. Normal procedures fail when reality exceeds what procedures were designed to handle. People have to improvise responses to situations they were never trained for, never imagined facing, never wanted to encounter. The Thornton Abbey mass grave shows that humans 600 years ago faced those same impossible choices and found ways to respond that preserved dignity and humanity despite circumstances explicitly designed by catastrophe to destroy both. They didn't do everything perfectly. Perfect response was impossible when half the community was dead or dying. But they did what they could. And what they could do was enough to enable psychological survival for individuals, enough to permit eventually processing collective trauma, enough to maintain humanity during catastrophe that could have destroyed it permanently. One final question before we finish this journey into medieval trauma processing. Comment, processed, if you made it through this entire video about mass graves and psychological horror without clicking away. And tell me, which other Black Death site should I cover in detailed follow-up video? East Smithfield in London with its organized emergency cemetery containing thousands of plague victims? The Paris mass graves discovered under modern supermarkets? The German plague pits in Nuremberg with 700 bodies stacked in 7 layers? The Italian cemeteries where entire families were buried together? I'll make a follow-up video about whichever location gets the most requests in comments. Comment the location name plus processed, so I can count votes accurately and give you the content you actually want. Let's crowdsource which plague trauma story needs detailed exploration next. The lesson from Thornton Abbey's 500 bodies in one pit is this: humans can process the unprocessable if they're allowed to maintain dignity within catastrophe. If they can preserve ritual fragments even when full ritual fails completely. If they can make meaningful choices even when all available choices are horrible. If they can maintain human connection even when circumstances force dehumanization. The 500 bodies in one pit represent medieval people's attempt to do exactly that during humanity's worst pandemic. To bury their dead with whatever dignity remained possible during catastrophe that destroyed traditional burial. To maintain Christianity despite mass graves that violated Christian doctrine about proper death. To preserve humanity despite circumstances explicitly designed to destroy it through overwhelming trauma. They succeeded. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough. Enough to survive individually. Enough to eventually process collective trauma societally. Enough to transform that trauma into cultural and theological changes that ultimately improved European civilization for everyone who came after. The pit was filled in 1349. The bodies decomposed slowly over centuries. The site was forgotten and rediscovered 600 years later by archaeologists who carefully excavated and studied the remains. But the psychological processing those survivors achieved, the theological flexibility that made God's mercy primary over ritual correctness, the cultural transformation toward individualism and questioning of authority, the recognition that community bonds are fragile and contingent, the artistic traditions that made death visible and democratic. Those changes persisted and shaped the modern world we inherited. Those changes explain why modern Western culture values individual dignity over collective conformity, questions authority rather than accepting it automatically, emphasizes personal choice over traditional obligation, and maintains space for theological flexibility that medieval pre-plague Christianity lacked. We're still processing plagues and still learning these lessons repeatedly. COVID-19 killed millions worldwide and forced mass burial in some locations when more capacity was overwhelmed. Emergency morgues in refrigerated trucks outside hospitals. Mass graves on Hart Island in New York for unclaimed bodies. Cremations without family present violating cultural burial customs. All violations of modern burial traditions that caused psychological trauma comparable to medieval plague survivors' experiences. And modern survivors are processing the trauma using remarkably similar mechanisms. Maintaining ritual fragments like virtual funerals when physical gatherings became impossible, reinterpreting religious doctrines to accommodate deaths without traditional ceremonies, psychologically distancing from overwhelming death tolls while trying to maintain dignity for individual victims. Seeking scapegoats and explanations that restore sense of control when randomness seems unbearable, using dark humor. To cope with ongoing crisis when direct emotional processing would cause functional paralysis. Same basic psychological mechanisms. Different historical century. Same fundamental humanity trying desperately to process trauma that seems unprocessable. The pit at Thornton Abbey teaches us that humans have survived worse catastrophes than anything we face today. Have processed worse trauma than modern pandemics inflict. Have maintained dignity and humanity through worse circumstances than we can imagine from our comfortable modern perspective. 500 bodies in one pit. 3 days to dig under emergency conditions, 6 hours to fill with corpses, and 600 years to fully understand the psychological implications. But eventually, with sufficient time and collective effort and psychological flexibility and willingness to transform trauma into cultural growth rather than remaining permanently broken, humans process even the unprocessable. Even mass graves dug hastily during pandemic. Even violations of sacred ritual forced by emergency. Even deaths that contradict every theological explanation and shatter every framework for understanding reality and meaning. Humans process it. Eventually. Imperfectly. But successfully enough to survive, to continue as individuals and societies, to transform trauma into wisdom that helps future generations face their own catastrophes with slightly better preparation and understanding. The bodies remain in the ground at Thornton Abbey beneath a small mound that modern tourists mostly ignore. The pit was carefully refilled after archaeological study. The dead rest peacefully now after 6 centuries. But their story remains absolutely essential for understanding human psychology under extreme stress. Their mass burial represents every human being ever forced to process unprocessable trauma. Every survivor choosing between impossible options when all choices violate deeply held values. Every person maintaining dignity when circumstance systematically destroys dignity. Every human being who discovers that the mind can survive horrors that seem psychologically fatal if given permission to adapt. Permission to preserve meaning fragments even when complete meaning fails, permission to transform trauma into growth rather than remaining permanently broken by catastrophe. 500 bodies. One pit. And permanent proof that humans can process anything given time, community support, psychological flexibility, and permission to adapt traditions when survival requires adaptation. The medieval people who dug that pit, who shrouded those bodies with care, who threw their children's corpses into mass burial, who survived to establish memorial markers and endow prayers and transform Christian theology and reshape European culture fundamentally, they processed the unprocessable successfully. They survived psychological trauma that modern mental health professionals would consider potentially fatal to sanity. They not only survived individually but eventually thrived collectively, using their trauma as catalyst for cultural transformation that improved civilization for everyone who came after them. That's the real enduring story of the Thornton Abbey mass grave. Not just death statistics, not just plague history, but human psychological resilience demonstrated in the face of catastrophe. The fundamental capacity to process the unprocessable when processing becomes the only alternative to psychological death. The ability to maintain humanity when circumstances systematically destroy everything that makes us human. The strength to survive, adapt, and eventually transform trauma into collective wisdom that benefits future generations facing their own catastrophes. The pit is closed now. The bodies are buried permanently. But the story continues echoing through time, teaching each generation that humans can survive and process and grow from even the worst trauma imaginable. 500 bodies in one pit. And proof that processing the unprocessable remains possible for anyone willing to maintain dignity fragments, preserve meaning fragments, and transform horror into wisdom slowly over time.